Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Welcome to today's show. Where are you this week? I am still in the bus. We are traveling. We are on the East Coast. Actually having some meetings this week here in Pennsylvania. And then we will be heading back to Denver. This week's topic is one that we have talked about on this show in the past, but I think it's time for an update. I recently came across an article that kind of triggered some thoughts on the topic of innovation adoption. Now, there's two sides of this coin. There's innovation adoption of the innovation and the ideas that you are working on. And then there's you. And how do you think about the adoption of the innovations that you use, whether that be products or services, whether you're an owner of a business or you are part of staff, or whatever role you play? What is it you mentally go through from the standpoint of innovation adoption? So two sides to the coin. How do people adopt your innovations? And then how do you adopt innovation? Today's show, we're only going to focus on one side of that coin, and that is innovation adoption from the standpoint of how people adopt your ideas, your innovations, and how would you do that in order to secure a higher probability of success in getting the vast majority of people and businesses and organizations, your target customers, to adopt, use, and become raving fans of the ideas and the innovations that you're working on. So that is today's show. It's innovation adoption, about your innovations, about your ideas, and how you need to think about this. Now, some of you, it may come across as, oh, we've talked about this, but I think it's a good refresher. Some new points I'm making in today's show. And we also talk about Jeffrey Moore in Crossing the Chasm. Jeffrey has been on the show 3 times. I think, in fact, he's the author that has been on the show more than any other author in our 17 years. So we will have links to Jeffrey's past episodes so you can hear what Jeffrey has to say also about this. So take a listen. Think about it long and hard, because this is so critical. 95% of innovations, in my opinion, fail because innovators do not think about the adoption of their innovation, the adoption of their ideas by others. And that is critical for the success. So before we jump into today's show, got a favor to ask: like, follow, and share. Like today's show, give it a thumbs up. Let's share it with others. Let other people know, and then follow us on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, however, just let me know that you are a listener of the show, and I will accept those invitations. So, with that, let's jump into today's episode of Killer Innovations. So once you've developed this great breakthrough innovation that you have developed, what do? How do you plan getting that innovation out there and getting it adopted? Over the years, there have been a variety of different models created, but the most prevalent one that most innovators use is called the innovation adoption model. It is the framework that lays out the audience and who would be early adopters of something or late adopters of something. And it's those phases, those pieces, and the key here is to think about, how do you market to them? Now, this is assuming that you are the innovator and you are pushing out an innovation that you're trying to get others to purchase, buy, license, subscribe to. The flip side is where do you sit in this curve? You as a consumer, you as a business, where do you sit? And they interact. They have they get to be mingled together a little bit. So you may be an innovator, developing new, great breakthrough things, but in practice, maybe you're not an early adopter. Maybe you're a late adopter. And that does have an impact, but I'm not going to talk about that in today's show. Today, we are just going to lay the framework, the foundation for innovation adoption. Now, what do I mean by innovation adoption? It is this model that classifies the adopters of innovation based on their level of readiness. Readiness to accept something new, readiness to try something very early, right after it's made available. In innovation adoption has certain characteristics. Each of these phases of adopters, and people kind of get bucketized into these different groups, there are certain characteristics. And the assumption, though, is that there's this, predictable process, I guess is the best way to describe it, before it gets widely adopted, before it becomes mainstream. There's a certain few early steps, groups that you need to get to accept your innovation, accept your idea in order to go forward and turn it into mass success. So, what are these groups? Well, the first group is the innovators. These are the ones that are right up in front. These are the ones that will try anything. These are the true geeks who buy on the promise of the innovation. They're visionaries. They're out there willing to try anything. One, in the form of support of other innovators, but two, they want to be on the bleeding edge, not just the leading edge, the bleeding edge. They're the first to try new ideas and things. Those are your coworkers or your friends and family who've got the latest and greatest gadget, software, technology, product that they've bought, they saw online that they've ordered. These are the first to try. They're risk takers. They're risk takers because you may buy something and it says it's going to do X, and maybe it's not quite ready when it first ships. So it is risky. But these are risk takers who skillfully leverage other sources, user groups, other fans of that technology, and they come around that technology or that product or that service or that whatever it is in order to figure out how to make it work for them. So they don't go back just to the company. They actually like to plug in to that community. This is a relatively small segment in the total numbers, but it's much larger in terms of their influence. These early innovators are the ones that other people follow. They follow them on social media. They follow them on their own podcast or whatever. And if they say, hey, I've tried out this new thing and I think this is really interesting, it's got some rough edges, but here's how I use it, whatever it might be, you would refer to these as influencers. Influencers that are out there that others will follow. So this is this first group, innovators. Again, very small group, big influence, can have huge impact downstream. The next one is early adopters. These are the early pioneers. They're willing to take a hit and also regarded as visionaries who, rely on kind of their gut feel and experience. They're larger than innovators in size and critical to the success of innovation. So they're not quite on the bleeding edge. I would call them on the leading edge. They could be influenced by innovators. These early adopters are ones that maybe don't get it right out of the gate, but they're pretty quick afterwards. After they've seen this community form, they've seen some comments back and forth, they see how this is going to work, they see some indications on how they can apply it, and they will jump in. These are the early adopters. Next up is the early majority. This is the more mainstream segment of the market and more than twice the size of the first two groups. So your early majority is bigger than the innovators and the early adopters combined. The group likes new things and innovations, but prefer to wait. They want to see if an innovation is successful before adopting it themselves. They're not adopting it just because it's new and cool and they want to try it out. They are adopting it because they can see how it applies to them. It can make them more productive. It can make them more effective. It can make them more money. It can help them influence others. It can help in their success. They're not looking at it just because it's new. They're looking at it because it's new and they can see and perceive value in it. It's going to have some form of a positive impact on them. That is the early majority. Next is the late majority. Now, these are the same size as the early majority. So early majority and late majority, big portion of the market. In fact, when you see the innovation adoption curve, it kind of looks like a bell curve. Very low at the beginning, big peak, trailing off at the end. Early majority, late majority are the two of the biggest portions of the market segment. The late majority, same size as early majority, and these are people who only adopt innovation when they're forced to do so, when they don't have another option. These are the people who had feature phones and finally moved over onto a smartphone, only because the feature phones, you couldn't find one. They didn't make them anymore. People who have Blackberries who finally had to switch hardware platforms. These are people who only adopt innovations when they are forced to do so. This is a segment that's harder to persuade and influence, especially through advertising, online information. These are the people who are not persuaded to buy something or try something new in the traditional sense. They have a high regard for advice and influence of friends and colleagues. So, social media advertising, TV ads, this is not a segment that is reached in that way. You have to basically use the people that you have in the form of the innovators, the early adopters, and the early majority, and get them to influence their friends and family who are in that late majority. So something to think about as you're rolling out your innovation is, how do you use the first three categories to influence this very large, very, very important category that you cannot reach in the traditional way of just doing advertising and those kinds of things. And then last, you have laggards. Now, the laggards is the same size as the innovators and early adopters, but with a completely different mindset. This last group they will adopt something, but they'll do it kicking and screaming. They will do everything not to try or change. Everything they have, it works fine. Why do they need to change? These are the naysayers of any change. They're only embracing or adopting an innovation when it's absolutely forced to do so, when they do not have another option, and they have hung on to their way of doing it for as long as possible. Now, again, strong reliance on the advice and influence of friends and colleagues, but still difficult to convince them, even when those friends and colleagues tell them that, oh no, this is great, you ought to switch, you ought to try this new thing. But it's, again, you don't reach the late majority or the laggards through heavy marketing, branding, messaging, advertising. That is not an effective way. You have to find a different way to convince them that what you have developed, they will enjoy and they will get some form of personal benefit. So again, real quick, first one is innovators. Those are people on the bleeding edge. The early adopters, they are on the leading edge. They're not right there at the very first, but they're out there pretty early. The early majority, this is more of the mainstream segment. Big market. It's, more than the innovators and early adopters combined. They like new things, but they want to wait a little bit to see if the innovation is successful. They don't want to jump in and then find out that it's not going to have a version 2, or jump in and the company's not going to be around, or they're going to jump in and the product is a total bust. So again, early majority. Late majority, same size as the early majority, but these only adopt the innovations when they're forced to do so. Hard to persuade. They are influenced by their friends and colleagues, not by advertising, not by marketing, not by traditional promotion. And then the laggards. So innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards. Now, you're probably sitting here going, I already knew that, Phil, or hey, maybe I hadn't thought about this in a while, and I got to think about this a little bit on how do I market my product, my service. And therefore, you just go, okay, I'm going to advertise like crazy with the innovators, the early adopters, and the early majority. Just advertise it. Not going to work. You've got to focus. You've got to literally crawl up the curve, crawl through these phases with a unique strategy for each phase. So your strategy for getting the innovators is different than your strategy for the early adopters, and completely different than your strategy for the early majority. Now, this struggle of climbing the curve and putting together your strategy came from Jeffrey Moore, who wrote a book called Crossing the Chasm. Now, Jeffrey has actually been on this show, I want to say 3 times. It might have been 4 times. He's one of the authors who's been on this show the most. Jeffrey and I have been friends for many, many, many years. So you can go back and listen to those episodes to hear Jeffrey talk about this specifically. But in the case of Crossing the Chasm, there's this chasm between the early adopters of a product and the early majority. So your innovators to early adopters, they're kind of somewhat similar. They're bleeding edge, leading edge, try something new and experiment. The early majority, remember, they're waiting to see if it's successful. They want to see if there's enough momentum. They want to see if there's enough support from other people before they jumped in. And Jeffrey calls that the chasm. You've got to cross that chasm if you are going to have a widely successful innovation. And to do that, you have to target the customers, the market segments, those things that are in the innovators and early adopters, or maybe completely different from the majority, the different customer needs, different focuses, different segments you would go after. You can leverage, and you should leverage, what has happened, particularly in the early adopters, and leverage that into the early majority. But you need to think about that strategy. How do you get enough momentum coming out of those early adopters to give you enough speed, enough acceleration, enough energy and excitement over what you've developed to cross the chasm and make it into the early majority? Now, this is difficult. It's not something that you can just advertise your way into or market your way into. You have to develop a strategy from the standpoint of what is that momentum? What is the right momentum that is going to transition? Jeffrey has another strategy that he calls the bowling pins. So if you think about bowling pins as being different industries or different use cases, and you position the bowling pins such that as you progress and you solve one use case, one industry's problems, there's a natural next industry, next problem case similar to it, that if you knock over that first bowling pin, it bumps into and knocks over the second bowling pin, and then knocks over the third bowling pin. So in effect, if you lay out your strategy and target your segments, Target the use cases, target the problems that customers, businesses, organizations, whoever has. If you lay it in a proper order, when you knock over that first bowling pin, it tips and falls into the second one, falls into the third one, and then you get momentum, you get excitement, you get energy, and those are some of the strategies that you can apply to cross that chasm. Now, Jeffrey has written, Crossing the Chasm. I'm trying to remember when it was written. Probably back in the late 80s. If you've done your MBA, you've probably was required reading. Jeffrey has written a number of books since then that are kind of more in depth onto the different strategies, like the tornado strategy, etc., on how to get across this chasm. This chasm is the biggest struggle for 99% of innovations. Innovations that are great and could be just absolutely phenomenal breakthrough innovations, things that are going to transform people's lives. And as innovators, we think of ourselves as being the proxy. Well, if I like it and I'm an early adopter and I've shown it, I've got innovators and early adopters all excited. Woohoo, I got a win. I'm going to high five. Off we go. No, that tends to be the easier portion. Why? Because those are people just like you, typically. The hard part is the early majority are not the people who are innovators, who are trying to develop new things or coming up with new ideas. These are the people looking for an innovation, a product, a service, a technology, a new approach, a new whatever it is that's going to make their life better. Life better is save them some time, make them some more money, save them money, have a happier life, all the things that people use when they think about, am I going to spend money for this and what do I get in return? So their value proposition and how they make their decisions is completely different from innovators and early adopters. And if you go in thinking that, oh, I'm the proxy, you are not the proxy. You need to develop that strategy. You need to think long and hard. And what I would advise is get somebody to come in, to come alongside you, a partner, people you trust, people not like you, to think about how would you cross the chasm? How do you go from an innovator, early adopter, to early majority? What is it around your innovation? How are you going to make that leap? Because if you expect it to just happen, where you don't think about it, you don't develop an approach, you don't find a way to test different approaches in order to cross the chasm, you will fail. And as I said, 95% plus of all innovations fail when trying to cross the chasm. Jeffrey actually says it's lower than that percentage. In my opinion, 95% of innovations that fail because they did not cross the chasm. So, this, again, as I wrap up, that one piece of advice I wanted to give you is think long and hard, just not about that stage, but all of them. How do you attract the innovators? How do you identify and attract the early adopters? How do you cross the chasm to secure that interest of the early majority? And then how do you use your fan base of innovators, early adopters, and early majority to get the late majority to embrace what it is you've developed? And then last but not least, the laggards. Again, how do you use your fan base of innovators, early adopters, early majority, and yes, even your fans in the late majority to get the laggards? So you need to think about who you're targeting and how to get into each of these phases. And then how do you use that phase of the innovation adoption cycle to move into the next phase? And if you develop a good, robust strategy with some good advice, some good advisors, coach, mentors, people who've done it before, you can take that innovation that you're working on right now and turn it into a true game changer that becomes highly impactful, that gets adopted by the majority of people out there, and you will have the success you deserve. I would suggest that this week, take a step back from the innovations you're working on and do a postmortem. Look at the innovation adoption strategies of your past ideas, of your past innovations, both ones that were successful and maybe ones that aren't successful. If this is your first innovation, the first innovation that you're working on that you're trying to bring into the market, then just take a look at what you're doing now and go through this innovation adoption model and identify your strategy for all 5 phases: innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards. If you have a good, robust strategy around each of those phases, along with how you deal with the chasm between early adopters and the early majority, you can turn your idea, your innovation, into a game changer that will bring you success. So I want to say, before we close up, I want to just express my appreciation for taking the time out of your busy schedule to listen to the show. I truly, truly appreciate it. Time is one of the most valuable assets you have, and you've chosen to invest that time with us, and we greatly appreciate it. So thank you. One favor I always ask for at the end of the show is tell others about the show. If there's something in today's show that you think somebody else should hear, whether it be your manager, your boss, your board of directors, your investors, whatever it might be, share it with them. Just get the link off of the site over at killerinnovations.com and forward them the link. They can listen to the audio directly. They don't need to log into anything. You can just send them the link directly to the audio file, and they can listen to it through any browser. Give us also some feedback. Give us a review over at iTunes or Google Podcast or iHeart or Spotify or wherever you listen to the show. Give us a review. Let us know what you think. We look at all those. We review all of those. Also, if you've got an idea for an upcoming show, if there's a question that you're just kind of nagging on that we haven't addressed yet, or something specific to what you're working on and you think it would be a good episode of the show, let me know. Just drop an email at phil@killerinnovations.com. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's show. As I said at the beginning, we are in Pennsylvania, heading back to Denver. We will be back in the next 3 or 4 months. We will be back in the Southeast for a while. Then we will be in Dallas, Richardson, Fort Worth area for a 1-week event. And then we will be in Washington, D.C., and then Atlanta in the early fall. So that's kind of the travel schedule. Love to meet up with people. If you're interested and you're interested in knowing where we're at, just drop me a note, phil@killerinnovations.com. And with that, thank you for your time. Greatly appreciate it. Go out there, innovate, change the world, make the world a better place. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.